What's happening, everyone that's watching us right now? My name is Kit. This is Americans Learn, and joining me for this episode is again my good friend Daniel, who's in the house. How you doing, Daniel?
Hey guys, what's going on? Excited for another episode here.
Well, yeah, and now things are gonna start heating up because we are now intensifying into the theater or this war theater known as the Pacific War that took place during the Second World War. And this next video that we are going to be getting our learn on from is from Kings and Generals. And this video is titled Why Japan Decided to Attack America. So, as with all the other previous videos that we've seen before, obviously the major conflict starts between the United States and the Empire of Japan. I think we're going to be learning some things that perhaps we haven't seen in our standard history classes that we've all taken before. Daniel, I want to get your thoughts before we put up the video.
Yeah, I think that I would echo that. I think that every part, it's just the fact that they did a multi-part prologue that's about as long as a standard movie, just to give context, says everything we can expect about what's about to happen.
Agreed. So then, without further ado, since I'm in charge of the ones and twos, I am going to pull up the video, and we are going to. And by the way, before we play the video, please support the original content creators. Kings and Generals have done a fantastic job in giving us detailed information in regards towards how the Empire of Japan modernized itself, and also how it became the empire that it was before, again, the United States and Japan faced off against each other. So please support the original content creators. They're doing a lot of good work. So now let's get ready to pull up that video and find out why Japan decided to attack America.
They wanted to make anime?
Well, not necessarily. That happened after the war, Daniel.
So I might have gotten the cause and effect wrong on that one.
Yeah, after the war.
With war raging in both Europe and in China, prying eyes around the world eagerly followed the events that were unfolding in front of them. In the US in particular, many still advocated for anti-war sentiment.
I just want to throw out there with Germany, they're like, this is really good footage. Should we take a picture of all the horses? Don't film the horses. Don't film the horses.
I'm sorry, Dan. Then you open up Pandora's box here because obviously, I really look. I'm a fan of alternate history if done properly, right? But the one thing I can't stand, it's been played to death in alternate history, is what would happen if Nazi Germany won? They weren't going to win. And no, do you have any idea what kind of hoops and twists and turns for Germany to have won? Okay. Now, yes, if certain things didn't take place, maybe the war would have gone on longer. Maybe if certain things weren't decided on, but they weren't going to win. Horse-drawn carriages, limited fossil fuels. Yes, they were throwing some left hooks and right hooks, but they weren't going to stand. Okay. Everyone needs to stop this. Like, oh, they could have won. No, they weren't going to win. Sorry.
I can give you how they could have won. Ready?
No.
There's as much oil in Germany as there is in Texas.
There is?
No, there isn't. There obviously is. I'm saying that if there was.
Yeah, okay. Maybe
that's to your point, though. It's like for Germany to win World War II, you have to fundamentally break the core components of what they were.
Yes, and it's horse-drawn carriages. That's what people don't talk about. Horses. Wilbur. Never mind. Anyways.
What, they had like 2 million horses or something?
Something like that, I think. I don't know. Whatever.
But President Franklin Delano Roosevelt had decided that he was not going to tolerate anymore the aggressions of the Japanese or the Germans. In 1941, he would finally draw a line to stop Japan that would surely risk war. And although FDR didn't want to fight against the Japanese, or at least not yet, this was a risk worth taking for the preservation of democracy around the world, a risk that would inevitably ignite the war in the Pacific. Welcome to our final prelude of the Pacific War. as the growing tensions between the US and Japan eventually ended in another act of aggression. By the way, don't forget to check out our podcast on the Pacific War. It has all the episodes in a long-form format with extra details. The link is in the description. And if you're interested in the history of the World Wars, you have to check out the Battlefields of the World Wars series on the sponsor of today's video, Magellan TV, which is our most loyal partner and the documentary platform of choice of the Kings and Generals team. This 8-episode series covers the 8 most decisive battles of the World Wars, including Verdun, the Bulge, and Dieppe, with a heavy emphasis on tactics and technology. Our favorite documentary.
All right, and we're going to fast forward through this, but please check out Magellan. They also do some good work too.
Yeah, all of these promos are like a year out of date for them anyway, so we're not costing them anything by skipping through them.
Yes.
Plus, you never know if a sponsor wants you to. If we don't know if Magellan likes us as a relay of their sponsorship anyway.
True on that. So, folks, just remember, please support the original content creators.
It is mid-1940, and Great Britain and China stand alone against the full might of Japan and the Axis. In Asia, the now 4-year-long conflict was completely depleting the resources of the Japanese Empire.
And Daniel, you brought this up in the previous videos. Like, this wasn't sustainable. This was a dumb idea that the military that was in now had influence over the government was doing. They were draining the resources away from the people, public works, and all that work that Meiji put in to reinstate the power of the emperor. Once again, the emperor was a puppet to the military-industrial complex, big business, and all the other special interest groups. They were the new shogunate. So out was the old, in was the new.
It's crazy because also if you look at like what happened with Germany in the same way, when Japan had enough oil and iron and all these other things that they needed to run the war in supply when they were invading China, they took very few casualties. And that's also, again, because they were fighting China, and China just decided they didn't want to modernize fast enough, or, you know, all the stuff that was happening with them. So they did that, and they really weren't facing any real opposition except a lot of peasants that really weren't ready for war. But that's where they burned through a huge amount of their fuel. Because if you think about it, you know, they were talking before about how they were like, you know, the two paths. It was the army path and the Navy path. The Army path is like, well, Army Path 1 going into China. So Army Path already scored a victory there in getting the majority of. But you got to imagine how much it actually takes. Like, how many liters of fuel, because we're talking in Asia, how many liters of fuel do you need to move a liter of fuel from Tokyo to the front line?
No,
and that's like a cost that people don't think about. So you think about that, ammunition, how much it actually costs to move all this stuff, and the fact that Japan just like Germany, is stockpiling, not really producing, which is, again, they talked already that's why they want to swoop down south to capture the oil, because just like, you know, Hitler wanted to capture the Caucasus for the oil. Oil is so important for countries that can't produce it. Meanwhile, in America, people are shooting the ground and oil is coming out of it. And so you can see here, so they say, well, we can just move north to try and take out the city. That's what the army wants to do, is if they're not already stretched on a giant front of over 1,000 miles against people that are getting supplied by the Lend-Lease and cash and carry. I'm not sure if Lend-Lease is factored in yet, but cash and carry at least.
No, I think around this time Lend-Lease is starting, because obviously this is the phase in which Japan was really already they're occupying large parts of China, already occupying all of Korea at the time too. So
and this,
Lend-Lease is around.
Yeah. So my point is that they already showed China's already getting supplied during this whole process with Western military equipment, which is actually, you know, probably better than anything. But by the way, the fun fact, and someone could check me on this if I'm not mistaken, if I am mistaken, the first Sherman tanks saw action in Russia because of Lend-Lease. Actually, that was mostly what the Lee was for. We sent the Lee especially to the USSR and Great Britain, because we're like, we don't have a medium tank ready. We got this. And then we made the Sherman right after.
There you go.
But the Russians, like, that's another thing that Russian footage never shows in their propaganda videos. That it wasn't just T-34s or any of that other. It was also a bunch of Shermans and Jeeps and a lot of American-made vehicles.
Stalin's like, thank you for the tanks, and then he went to his camera crew. Don't you show those tanks? Don't you show
exactly
those tanks?
Right. So here you have Japan, who's already exhausting itself just maintaining a foothold in China. The army doesn't want to take one step back because it would disgrace the people that were killed there. Doesn't matter that they could argue for all of Manchuria and Korea, and everyone would go okay because that's already what the U.S. previously agreed to. But the again, like you said, the civilian government is not lining up with the military government. So the civilian government says to country X, "Hey, we'll do this, this, and this," and then the army just overruns that. And then within the army, you can literally have a few officers. Like, Kit, you served in the Marines. Can you imagine if the U.S. military, with military bases everywhere, would automatically declare war on any country if a few officers said so and just started moving into an area outside of a military base?
There's a whole system in place stopping somebody from being a dummy. Trust me on it, man. It's I couldn't even. I mean, yes, there are people who have, who are not that bright in the military from all ranks above on down, but no one's that stupid. Not yet, anyways.
Well, in Japan, that seemed to be the number one way that they unofficially declared war on people.
Well, also you have to look at the fact that Japan at that point, what was it? It took them 40 years to modernize. So some remnants of the old Tokugawa shogunate and its ideology and the mythos of the samurai warrior. So he'll be right back. So the whole mythos of the samurai warrior, similar like how many Western countries look at the symbol of the knight, this heroic warrior that's unstoppable and goes for honor and glory. The imagery of samurai and knights are viewed as like noble. So here you have the Empire of Japan. They just get out of the Tokugawa shogunate, and of course during that time frame they modernize, but some remnants of that ideology still remain. Of course, I might be wrong on this, but there has to be at least maybe of an older generation that remembers the Tokugawa shogunate. So obviously they're telling their grandchildren of the era of the samurai warlords and the shogunate and glory, and that seeps into people's beliefs and points of views. And obviously the military and Navy at the time had their own perspective and thoughts. So, they weren't really controlled or centralized because there really wasn't, that major authority that would rein in officers.
Yeah. And for people, sorry, the background noise, it'll clear up in a second. I think that's a very good point. It's basically we're watching a shogun, maybe two shoguns, one being the army, one being the navy, vying for power over a puppet emperor. And it's like, again, a hammer only sees everything as a nail, and a military only sees things to be conquered. They don't get the back end, 3 years down the line, infrastructure support that they're going to need. And now that they're in this position, we know what they're going to do. We know they're going to invade South through the navies. We're in the future. That is something that they've put themselves in a box that they're refusing to get out of or negotiate themselves out of. They've killed their diplomatic trust in other countries that they will follow through with anything. So they've put themselves in a box that their only possible reaction is to attack more.
Yep.
Even though Japan already relied on other countries for the resources needed for its war material, the Americans alone provided them with 54.4% of their weapons and supplies, 76% of their aircraft, 59.7% of their scrap iron, 60.5% of their petroleum, and all of Japan's lubricating oil, machine.
I don't have to say anything. I'm just going to do this.
Yep. You got Seriously, all this could be avoided.
Tools, special steel, and high-test aircraft petrol. Furthermore, communist and nationalist guerrillas constantly harassed Japanese troops and sabotaged their infrastructure in occupied territories, and with each passing campaign, more and more soldiers were left behind to join these underground groups. The communists in particular were very capable of waging guerrilla warfare, as they had been doing so for the last 2 decades, and their experience allowed them to become ever more influential in the regions they defended, something that was not seen very fondly by their nationalist allies. To fight against these guerrillas, the Japanese would resort to puppet units of the new, reorganized National Government of the Republic of China, uniting all previous collaborationist states under Wang Jingwei's central government. But the Red Army would also prove that it was capable of executing important military operations, with Peng Dehuai's 100 Regiments offensive being launched in late August. Using a total of 400,000 soldiers, albeit poorly armed and equipped, over 115 regiments of the 8th Route Army, commanded by Zhu De, would attack railways and roads, and would target isolated Japanese strongpoints and forts all throughout northern China. The offensive would be very successful, inflicting more than 20,000 casualties, taking almost 3,000 strongholds, sabotaging many bridges, mines and tunnels, and destroying large tracts of railways. The operation was controversial, as Peng Dehuai initiated it without authorization from Mao Zedong, and would be criticized harshly for this. Although the Japanese response to guerrillas had always been brutal, the defeat against the communists had an unexpected consequence. Japan would adopt the 3 alls policy, as their forces would then start to kill all, loot all, and burn all. With this bloodier response against Chinese resistance, many war crimes would be committed by Japanese soldiers, and resentment would erupt once again between nationalists and communists, as Chiang Kai-shek's followers blamed the Red Army, and Mao Zedong blamed Peng Dehuai for the harsher Japanese acts. Furthermore, from October to December, Japanese counterattacks would successfully regain control of railway lines and would inflict heavy casualties on the 8th Route Army. At this point, Japan knew that prolonging the war would be dangerous if foreign powers decided to intervene, so it needed to completely cut off the enemy capital at Chongqing from the foreign aid that it was receiving. Since the outbreak of the war, the British and Americans had been sending war material by sea to the main Chinese ports and Hong Kong, as well as through the railway connecting French.
I think that's £2 million a month.
Monthly too. That, can you imagine the logistics in getting that done?
Well, the U.S. is like, we got a lot of ships for moving cargo around. That's kind of our thing.
Yeah, you know, I again, just even looking at the occupation of China right now, no, it was only a matter of time before they break. They're gonna fall faster than the Roman Empire did. So I mean,
they have no weapons. They really don't have any trained troops. I'm sure they've gotten trained by attrition.
Yeah,
they barely have any. I'm sure they barely even have vehicles. There are 2 interfighting armies that are both claiming leadership of the country at the same time. They've lost most of their coastal and territorial and industrial base, and they're still fighting.
Yep.
If Japan is like getting like the best case scenario of an opponent, it's not enough.
Exactly. And unfortunately, you know, this conflict is going to further intensify. But again, none of this was necessary, and already this occupation, we're seeing, like, again, areas like Hong Kong and Nanking that were severely brutalized by the Empire of Japan.
Indochina to Yunnan and South Guangxi. Moreover, the Soviets, longtime rivals of Japan in the east, were also sending much aid through the old Silk Road, although this would only last until the outbreak of Operation Barbarossa.
Interesting.
With most of the main Chinese ports already
occupied. I didn't know that either.
And the British possession.
Obviously, this is before Mao took over, and you also have to take into account that even when Mao did eventually establish, obviously later on, when Mao was able to unify all of China, there was a little bit of a tense relationship between China and the USSR for a little bit, not I don't know how
Yeah.
long they kind of had they had somewhat of an intense rivalry back in the day.
But the other thing I'm realizing as part of that, I'm sure, is that sure the U.S. and Britain are sending stuff by boat, but that also means they can send the stuff to the USSR, and then the USSR will move it into China for them.
True. That could be done too, at least until Barbarossa.
And they're like, no, we need
in
this.
China
Yeah.
surrounded, the Japanese then prepared for an offensive against Indochina, the last Chinese lifeline. In that regard, they had advanced up to the Indo-Chinese border by late July, taking the key district of Longzhou in South Guangxi. Already back in June, the fall of France had allowed Tokyo to issue a series of ultimatums demanding the closure of all supply lines to China, among other things. The Indo-Chinese government had no other alternative but to comply, and by September 22nd, the Japanese had successfully negotiated to station 6,000 troops in Tonkin and to move 20,000 soldiers through Tonkin to Yunnan. The Indochina Expeditionary Army.
Well, I'm really glad that Indochina secured a peace treaty with Japan. I'm sure they're not going to get invaded anytime in the future.
No problem. What could possibly go wrong? What could go wrong?
Under General Nishimura Takuma was then formed, starting to travel to their destination on the same day. But at the same time, General Kuno Seiichi's 22nd Army at Nanning independently invaded Annam and started to fight local forces across the border. The fighting ended when General Maurice Martin's Indo-Chinese forces got surrounded at Langsun, finally surrendering on September 25th.
Furthermore, this makes it really hard to do diplomacy. I just want to put that out there. Yeah. Hey, man, we just negotiated. You can have 6,000 troops in one of our cities, and you can move troops through the country. We will not fight you. We will not cause a guerrilla warfare. We will stop supplying China. And then then some officers in the 22nd are like, well, let's invade anyway, even though the deal was made.
Yeah, I mean, seriously. That's not how things work, buddy.
The IJN blockaded the Gulf of Tonkin, and Nishimura landed in Indochina, fighting a series of minor battles at Dongtak, Haiphong, and Hanoi. By the evening of September 26th, Kuno's forces had reached Laotsai at the Yunnan border, and Indo-Chinese resistance had crumbled. The invasion was a huge success, but it was against Tokyo's wishes due to the agreement that the Japanese had reached. All occupied towns would then be returned, and Kuno would be punished for his insubordination, although the Japanese were now undisputed in the region and could then station 40,000.
What's up?
That I remember anywhere in this show where a Japanese officer invades or does something that hurts the diplomatic effort or the bigger strategy and actually gets punished and has to withdraw.
Well, good. It's like, dude, you screwed it up. We got enough problems as it is.
1,000 soldiers in northern Indochina. But the Japanese success wouldn't be long-lasting, as the British consequently decided in October to open the Burma Road, connecting the Burmese city of Lashio with Yunnan's capital at Kunming. Thus, to the relief of Chiang's government, a new lifeline was created, allowing the Chinese to continue to resist for the next few years. Moreover, General Sonobe Waichiro's 11th Army tried to capitalize on the last victory in Yichang to completely take over the province of Hubei. On November 25th, the Japanese offensive began, striking against the Chinese defenses east and west of the Xiang River and enjoying some initial successes. But in coordination with local guerrillas, Li Zongren's forces would manage to stop the invaders and counterattack, forcing the Japanese to retreat by November 30th. Meanwhile, the US government was outraged and alarmed by the Japanese invasion of Indochina, so President Roosevelt would then double the amount of aid delivered to China and would order the evacuation of all Americans in the Far East. Although the Americans were still woefully unprepared for a war in the Pacific, they now began to see that a confrontation with the Japanese was very possible.
There was a documentary series that I saw a while back. It was Ken Burns on World War II. He's the one who made that really great series about the Civil War. And I have my opinion because I'm not too much of a big fan about his recent work that he did with World War II, mainly because anyways, I'll talk about my disagreements with it later. But I found it interesting that there was Americans that were put into a camp, civilians, by the Empire of Japan during that time. So I mean that's something interesting. So I'll talk about my criticism about the Ken Burns documentary another day, because there's just one thing that just kind of really just grinded my gears. Just that's it.
And so I just want to say, I hope those officers invading Indochina is worth the U.S. doubling the amount of supplies it's sending to China, and the British probably not wanting to negotiate with you anymore.
Yeah, there you go.
Japan's 1940 move into Vichy-controlled Indochina, along with its war with China, withdrawal from the League of Nations, alliance with Germany and Italy, and increasing militarization, raised tension and induced the United States to intensify its measures to restrain Japan's economy. Scrap metal shipments to Japan were embargoed, and the Panama Canal closed to Japanese trade.
Wait, pause.
Despite these moves, in
There
early
you go.
93% of Japan's copper came from the United States.
Brilliant idea.
Hey, you know what? You know that country over there that has all the infrastructure laid out and the ability to move that stuff around real easily? Let's screw them over and just get it from the untapped source, or the barely tapped source.
Agreed.
I traded millions of barrels of oil, a lot of 93% of my copper, most of my iron, my airplane parts, my specialized metals, my jet fuel, for some oil barracks in Indonesia.
This is a bad idea. Long sad history of bad ideas.
In 1941, Japan moved into southern Indochina, thereby threatening British Malaya, North Borneo, and Brunei. On December 29th, FDR then delivered his tough Arsenal of Democracy speech against Germany and Japan, clearly identifying them as the enemies of democracy, and finally dropping the neutrality doctrine that had been sponsored in the 30s. Consequently, American industries would start to arm and support China and the Allies in their respective wars. This would eventually lead to the Lend-Lease program of March 11, 1941, in which the US pledged to support the Allies and China with food, oil, warships, warplanes, and other weaponry. The US froze Japanese...
They don't go over this fully, the cash and carry versus Lend-Lease.
Mm-hmm.
But effectively, at a certain point, there was no more cash in any of these countries. London had given out its stores, and America, by the way, at the end of this is like, wow, we just happen to have all of the gold and silver in the world. I can't figure out why that happened. But this is when Lend-Lease happens.
Yeah, okay, so we stand corrected. So this is when Lend-Lease was really going down. And I think this is nearing the end of 1940, because pretty soon we're going to be getting to 1941 and the buildup. Or maybe we're already in 1941. So, yeah, and already you could see just how much land is being occupied by Germany at the time. And then you're also seeing Japan too. And it's not looking too good. It's not looking too good for the Allies at the moment.
These assets on July 26, 1941, and on August 1st, established an embargo on oil and gasoline exports to Japan, which was a strong response as 80% of Japan's oil was coming from the US, and oil was crucial for war making in that period. Concurrently, the Kingdom of Thailand.
What's up?
In that period, what do you mean? Do you mean every industrialized war?
Yeah.
So this is the other thing about this is, like, again, so Lend-Lease comes in partially as a response to Indochina. Now the U.S. is just going to go, yeah, we'll pay you to send stuff as a gift, and it's going to jumpstart our economy, and then we're going to be able to produce everything. And this is not good for any of the Axis powers.
Right on.
Which had seen a rise of ultra-nationalism and the establishment of a dictatorship under Plek Phibun in the last few years, also detected the weakness in French Indochina and thus decided to take back some disputed areas that had been ceded in the last century. After the outbreak of border skirmishes, the Thais started aerial bombing runs over the main Indo-Chinese cities and launched an offensive on Laos and Cambodia in early January. Laos would be quickly overrun, but French resistance in Cambodia would be fierce, and with the French naval victory at the Battle of Ko Chang on January 17th, the situation soon started to deteriorate for the Thais. Fearing a French victory in the war, the Japanese would then intervene, forcing the Indo-Chinese government to sign an armistice and to cede the disputed provinces. This was a personal victory for Phi Bun, but the real beneficiaries of the war would be the Japanese, who further increased their influence in both Thailand and Indochina. Fearing a Japanese takeover, Phi Bun would then reach out to the US and the UK for guarantees.
Sorry about attacking Indochina. So can you guys help me out too? Because this
Yeah.
Empire of Japan, I don't know. Something about them. They're not cash money.
Do you remember in the oversimplified Punic War video
Yeah.
how what were they named? The Myrtocles or something like that when they left and they took over that one city and they're like, hey, Carthage, can you protect us? Oh, wait, the Carthaginians. Hey, Rome, can you protect us? I'm getting those kind of vibes.
Yes, and hey, everything turned out fine between Carthage and Rome. There was no problems whatsoever. Nothing to worry about here, folks.
Consequently stressing his relationship with Japan. And back in China, 1941 would start with the sudden outbreak of hostilities between nationalists and communists. Chiang Kai-shek ordered a withdrawal of the Fourth Army from Anhui and Jiangsu in late December. As a result of numerous alleged treacherous acts and harassment, Chiang would take action of retribution against the communists. On January 7th, while withdrawing from Anhui and Jiangsu, the communists' new Fourth Army was, allegedly, ambushed and encircled by an 80,000-strong nationalist force of Gu Zhutong's Third War Area. After heavy fighting and many casualties, only 2,000 communist soldiers were able to break out of the encirclement by January 13th.
Can you pause it?
This marked the end of the...
These two sides were fighting right now, but the side that just enveloped, the NRA, didn't realize that their grandchildren would be making microchips as a result of this.
Madness.
The Second United Front, as the nationalist act of treachery would destroy any possibility of further cooperation. At the same time, Sonobe would start 2 new operations against South Henan and Western Hubei, as well as a large offensive against the city of Shanggao. Yet again, the Chinese would successfully flank and defeat the Japanese invasions by late March, inflicting heavy casualties and forcing the invaders to retreat and to leave behind substantial amounts of military equipment and supplies. As the latest defeats were very demoralizing for the Japanese forces, their victory at the Battle of South Shanxi in May would luckily restore their fighting spirit. On May 7th, General Tada Hayao's North China Area Army launched a full offensive against the mountainous region of South Shanxi, quickly breaking through the Chinese defensive lines at Mengshan, Jiyuan, Hengpu and Guangyuan, and managing to encircle the Nationalist Army as a result. Worthy of mention is that the Communist 8th Route Army nearby refused to assist the Nationalist forces in the struggle in retribution for the South Anhui incident, and in the struggle allowed them to be surrounded and destroyed. This was remembered as one of the worst defeats of the entire war for China. Meanwhile, the outbreak of the German invasion of Russia in late June permitted Japan to sign a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, and thus to secure its northern border in case of war with the Allies. This finally allowed the Japanese to begin preparations for a strike against the resource-rich region of Southeast Asia, which had been earmarked to provide the necessary raw material for Japan's industry. The Dutch East India...
Again, long said history of bad ideas, because you got to maintain it. If you're an island nation, right, and you're trying to take over and occupy these lands, you need machines. What do machines need? They need gas, oil, and
They-
other
metal.
metal. Thank you, and so much more. So much more. This cannot be maintained.
And that's the other thing is that here's the thing that gets me is that Japan seems to be very aware, especially because of the shipbuilding that Roosevelt started doing recently. They talked about it a few episodes ago, and they're like, oh my God, we're going to be completely outclassed. From my understanding, extracting resources to get it up and running and make it optimal takes a bit of time, maybe even years back then to really happen. So Japan's like, oh man, in like 2 years, America is going to be way stronger than us. We can't stop it. Let's put a plan in place so that we're ready for them in 3 years.
So one other thing here too, and I'm not going to say like, I don't want this to be taken out of context, but when the architect of Pearl Harbor, Admiral Yamamoto, and I don't know if they'll talk about it later on in the second video that we'll watch, but he was outspoken to his critics, saying, hey, look, I advise against attacking America. This is a bad idea. And I think I don't want to misquote him or anything, but I know
I think his statement was closer along the lines of, this is a bad idea, but if we're going to do it, I should be the guy leading it.
That, and he also said, I'm going to need everything because we have 1 year to. He didn't say two. We have 1 year to really pull this off and to really put them at the negotiating table, because he was indicating like we need to get them to a negotiation table with a major victory, and I can't have otherwise it won't work.
And that's ironic because they've just spent the last few years destroying their diplomatic integrity.
Yeah.
So that no one's going to believe them anyway.
Yeah, so that's another thing too. Like again, their credibility is already gone. But there were some people who were against. I wouldn't say they were peacemakers or anything like that, but were against any kind of military action against the United States or Great Britain, because there was a bigger picture at play here. And they're like, no, it just can't be done. And if it is going to be done, we need to be fully dedicated to one person leading it. And to your point, Yamamoto was saying like, look, I need to be the one leading it. But did they listen? No, they did not.
No, they put themselves in an outcome where this was their best case scenario, but you had to do a lot of bad things to get to a spot where this is your best case scenario.
Agreed.
And their precious rubber plantations and oil fields were one of the most important objectives of the Japanese Empire. So on July 21st, more than 50,000 soldiers would invade southern Indochina to prepare naval bases against the Dutch colony. Accurately detecting the intentions of the Japanese, FDR would form the USAFFE in response, nationalizing the Philippine Army and appointing General Douglas MacArthur to lead American forces in the Pacific. In coordination with the...
Hey, Douglas. You can thank the Marines that you got the Philippines back.
I always when I was younger, I used to really like Douglas, but the more I learned about him, the more I realized how much of a diva he really was.
Are you kidding me? He was going to intensify war with China in the Korean War. That guy, that dude had the audacity to tell Harry Truman, to F off, right? And it's like, you can't tell the commander-in-chief that, Dougie. No. You need some Marines to slap you upside the head, Douglas. There you go. For those of you who don't know, the Marine Corps had a little bit of an antagonizing relationship with good old MacArthur here because, let's face it, he couldn't get things done without us, all right? There you go. Shout out to my fellow Marines.
The British and the Dutch. He would also stop the exports of iron ore, steel, and oil to the Japanese. And as we've seen, this was a crippling embargo for Japan, as the empire relied on foreign exports for its war machine, but also for its home economy. FDR's gamble was to put an end to the Japanese expansion, but Japan's leaders now saw war with the West as their best option, encouraged by their Nazi allies that were overrunning Europe. On September 3rd, the Supreme War Council met at the Liaison Conference and decided that if the US didn't resume oil shipments by October, then they would start preparations for a simultaneous attack against the Dutch East Indies, the Philippines, and Malaysia. The commander-in-chief of the IJN, Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku, also proposed a plan for a surprise attack against Pearl Harbor, intending to destroy the American Pacific Fleet in one decisive strike. This was very advantageous, because if the US lost their main naval forces in the Pacific, then it would take them years to build another fleet capable of fighting against the IJN, and that would give the Japanese a free hand to expand in Southeast Asia. While tensions in the Pacific reached a climax, the 11th Army, now under General Anami Kurachika, launched a new offensive against the city of Changsha. On September 27th, the Japanese managed to enter the city, but by October 8th, successful Chinese counterattacks carried out by General Xu Yue had expelled the invaders once more. This would end up being the last Japanese operation in China before the outbreak of hostilities with the West. As negotiations with the US were leading nowhere, on November 26th, a Japanese task force of 6 aircraft carriers left the Kuril Islands, heading to Hawaii in strict radio silence, and troop transports also started to move southwards from Formosa. With the US continuing to demand the Japanese completely withdraw from China and Indochina, by the start of December, Emperor Hirohito had approved the war declaration, setting in motion the attack on Pearl Harbor and the start of the Pacific War. Now there was no turning back for the Japanese Empire.
What could possibly go wrong? What could possibly go wrong?
Join us on December 7th, the 80th anniversary of Pearl Harbor, for special coverage of the operation that would begin one of the deadliest wars of the 20th century.
Now, for those of you who don't know, this is a little personal for me, because what I found out recently is that my family has had a lot of connections to Japan way back when. And so even before I was born, I had relatives and, even distant cousins I know or didn't know I had who visited Japan. And then, of course, I do have family members who are Japanese too. And it's just interesting how things have changed drastically since that infamous day at Pearl Harbor and where we all are now as nations and people. And I think it's just important to know that, everything does leave an impact, and our actions do echo through time. No matter how insignificant you might think they are, they do have an impact. It's like a ripple effect. So I'm just, it's just for me. I never really knew how much my family had ties to Japan, like in regards to visiting it or being there, or so much more. So even before yours truly was born on this third rock from the sun. So there you go. So all right. Obviously, Dan, do you want to have any closing arguments or closing statements? I said closing arguments. We're gonna.
I disagree. You don't have people that you know from Japan.
There you go. All right. Yeah. All right. So we'll see you next time, where we're going to be talking about the day that shall live in infamy, December 7th, the attack on Pearl Harbor. So we'll see all of you there. Until then, be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe. My name's Kit. That's my friend Daniel. We'll see you on the flip side.